I'm here with New York Times best-selling author John Burke. He's the pastor at Gateway Church in Austin, Texas. Released this book, which immediately went to the top of the New York Times charts, Imagine Heaven. And it is a fascinating mixture of scripture and accounts of near-death experiences. So we tend to think of near-death experiences as a fairly new phenomena because they've only really been reported seriously for about 40 years.
Yeah,
right?
last 40, 50 years.
But when you look back over history, you realize, well, maybe they were more common than we think. So here's my question for you. Do you think Paul or John may have had a near-death experience? Is that where they get their image of heaven? Or was it just a vision from God?
Well, I think Paul may have. You know, in Acts 14, it says that Paul was stoned to death, dragged out of Lystra, and left for dead.
Yes.
And then he gets up and goes back into the city.
Right.
And then he says in Corinthians later, he said, I know a man, and he's talking about himself.
Right.
I don't know whether in my body or out of my body, but I was taken up to the third heaven. And I think that's what he's talking about. And he talks about, you know, how eye has not seen, ear has not heard what God has prepared for us. So he's talking first person. Yeah. So I do think that he had a vision of heaven when he had that death experience. Now,
that kind of makes sense of the epistles too, where he says, I don't know whether it's better for me to stay here or to go to be with Jesus.
Yeah, and he said to be out of the body is to be with the Lord. I would much rather be there, but for your sake, I'll probably stay.
Right.
You know, and he longed for it. Yeah. Now, John, he had a vision.
Yeah.
So, you know, John sees Jesus on the island of Patmos, and then he's taken into heaven. But that's what I'm tying in, is how what he says he saw is what hundreds and hundreds of people say they saw. And when you see it from all their different angles, you start to see that, oh yeah, well, that's what Daniel was talking about in the Old Testament. That's what Ezekiel saw. He was taken up into heaven. Isaiah, you know, so this is not new. No, but God has given us, I think, even more evidence that it's real.
This book, to me anyway, personally, as I read it, is kind of like putting 100 or maybe even 1,000 different camera lenses on the same subject that Scripture takes us into. Yeah. So it's fascinating. You're going to want to get your copy of Imagine Heaven.